Sunday School teacher, I'm glad that you've joined us for our time of study. We're getting close to the end of our series in the book of Genesis. We're going to be looking at the lesson for Sunday, February the 17th. The title of this lesson is Opportunity Knocks. Sunday, February 17th, title of the lesson, Opportunity Knocks. We're in Genesis chapter 41. So get your Bible, get your notepad, get your pen. Let's work on this Bible study together and get ready to teach God's Word this coming Sunday. The point of this lesson is that God gives His followers opportunities to make a difference within His divine plan. In this study that we've got for Sunday is Joseph. Again, we're looking at Joseph, Jacob's son. In this study, he receives an opportunity to interpret the king of Egypt's mysterious dreams. Remember that Joseph, as well as his father Jacob, had dreams were part of their personality, their communication from God. So it's an important factor. He recognized the dreams as a message from God about a severe famine. The famine would be the opportunity for Joseph to be reunited and provide for his family. He did not know that, but that's what happened. So, Joseph was in prison. Again, you're going to have to set the stage for some of the people in your class that may have not been with you the past couple of weeks. So help bring them up to speed on where Joseph is and how he got there. That he was in prison after Potiphar's wife had falsely accused him. He had become the personal attendant for the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. Both were members of Pharaoh's court and had been imprisoned because they had offended the king. Remember, we talked about it last week that this was a minimum security jail. That's where the Pharaoh kept his prisoners. More than likely, what happened was the baker was there because he burnt something. The cupbearer was there because he spilt something. I mean, that's how minor. You spilt something, you go to jail. You burn the bread, you go to jail. And that's what was happening here. But because Joseph was a person of integrity, the warden made him the personal attendant for the cupbearer and the baker. Joseph interpreted the dreams for the cupbearer and the baker. Didn't end so well for the baker, but it did for the cupbearer. Basically, Joseph said, "Mr. Baker Man, because your dream, it tells me you're going to die. Not the cupbearer. You got a good dream." And what Joseph says to the cupbearer is, "Hey, you're out of here now. You're out of jail. Would you please remember me when you get out there?" And so that was the request. Well, 2 years had passed, and when none of the king's magicians were able to interpret the dreams of the Pharaoh, the chief cupbearer remembered this guy that interpreted his dream in jail 2 years earlier. His name was Joseph. And he told the Pharaoh about Joseph's ability to interpret the dreams. Now just think about that. He's got all these people that are well qualified. They're the best of the best. And they're going, "We don't know what that means." And here's this servant going, back, Pharaoh, remember when you put me in jail several years back? There was a guy there that interpreted my dream. So that's where we are. So the problem, look at verse 41, or chapter 41, chapter 41, verse 15. Start in verse 15 through 21. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said about you that you can hear a dream and interpret it. Verse 16, I am able to, Joseph answered Pharaoh. Or he says, I am not able to, Joseph answered Pharaoh. So he begins by saying, I can't do that. And then he goes on, it is God who will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Verse 17. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream I was sitting on the bank of the Nile, that's significant, when 7 well-fed, healthy-looking cows came upon the Nile, grazing on the reeds. Then after them 7 other cows, weak, very sickly and thin, came up. I've never seen such sickly ones in all the land of Egypt. Then the thin, sickly cows ate the first 7 well-fed cows. When they had devoured them, you could not tell that they had devoured them. Their appearance had not changed. They were as bad as they had been before, and I woke up. So here's the problem. The dream. Now, can you imagine? There's Joseph. 2 years had passed. He's still in jail. He's been there because he's been falsely accused. He's done nothing but do what he's supposed to. And no break. Well, one day, these guys come in and go, you're Joseph. The Pharaoh wants to see you. Can you imagine just the shock? Do what? You know, I don't know if it was like, oh my goodness, what? For me, I know how I would respond. I would respond, oh great, what's going to be, what's next? What's the next bad thing that's going to happen? Imagine that's what Joseph felt. This was not something where he's, oh, here's my chance. No, it was probably he didn't know what was going to happen. The Pharaoh wasted no time in presenting his problem in verse 15. He had heard the stories of Pharaoh while he was in jail from the cupbearer and the baker, and others, of course, and he knew that he was not an easy man to work for. You know, you burn the bread, you're going to jail. You spill the drink, you're going to jail. So he knew that he was not an easy man to work for. Joseph's immediate response to the king was both bold and humble. Here's the Pharaoh going, I hear you can fix my problem. And right off the bat, Joseph goes, nope, can't do it. I mean, that's bold. But then he goes on to say, it's not me, but it's God. And what's interesting there in verse 16, he says, it's God that's going to give you a favorable answer. And that word favorable is translated well-being or peace. In other words, Joseph, even before he heard the dream, he said, this is going to work out for your good. Verse 17, that's where the dream begins. In verse 17, the Pharaoh is at the Nile River. The Nile is significant because for the Egyptian people, they believed that it was the source of life and well-being. I mean, that Nile River was their life. And they were right. And in verse 18, he describes a pleasant, encouraging, peaceful scene. It's on the river. There are these 7 beautiful cows. Again, but when you look at the description of the cows in verse 18, they are described 7 well-fed, healthy-looking cows. Remember how we described Rachel? Remember how we described Joseph? The same description here. They're healthy, and they're good to look at. Beautiful picture. And then 7 sickly-looking cows arrive on the scene. And it is interesting because the Pharaoh said, and this was a well-traveled man. He was not one that just, he went everywhere. And for him to say, these are the sickest looking animals I've ever seen. I mean, he's seen it all. And for him to say, this is as bad as I've ever seen it, was significant. And then to the surprise, the 7 sickly cows ate the healthy cows. And not only that, you've seen on the National Geographic, one of those great big old pythons or whatever it is, they'll eat a cow and that big old snake is got a big old cow in its belly and you can tell that something's inside of it. Well, when the sick cows ate the healthy cows, it didn't make a bit of difference. They were still just as sickly as they were before. Their appearance and their condition did not change. And so that's the dream. And now Joseph has got to interpret that dream. So look at verses 33 through 36. So now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let the Pharaoh do this. Let him appoint an overseer over the land and take 1/5 of the harvest of the land of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. Let him gather all the excess food during those good years that are coming. Under Pharaoh's authority, store the grain in the cities so they may preserve it as food. The food will be a reserve for the land during the 7 years of famine that will take place in the land of Egypt. Then the country will not be wiped out by the famine. In verses 22 through 32, Joseph explained to Pharaoh the meaning of his dream. 7 years of abundant harvest, that's the healthy cows, followed by 7 years of devastating famine, that was the sickly cows. And the sickly cows were going to eat up everything, and if they didn't do something, there would not be enough to survive. So here Joseph says, you need somebody who's discerning and wise. That's the word that is used there, discerning and wise. That's choosing between the good and the best. Joseph said just having somebody who's good is not going to cut it. You're going to have somebody who's willing to make the best decision. Someone who would make the wisest decisions to benefit all. And then in verse 34, these food reserves would be vital for meeting people's needs during the 7 years of famine. Put them in the cities near the people in verse 35. And also because they would be more secure in the cities. And then verse 36, if they didn't do this, they would be wiped out. And then verses 37 through 40, the proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And he said to them, can we find anyone like this, a man who has God's Spirit in him? So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God made all this known to you, there's no one as discerning and wise as you. You will be over my house, and all my people will obey your commands. Only I, as king, will be greater than you. The Pharaoh, as well as those that couldn't interpret the dream, agreed with the plan that Joseph had presented. The Pharaoh acknowledged that only God was going to be able to accomplish the task in verse 38. And then in verse 39, since God had given Joseph the message, then he needed to be the one to lead out in the work. And in verse 40, that which Joseph dreamed when he was a 16-year-old boy came about. In verse 40, he became vice Pharaoh. He became the associate Pharaoh. I've given to you some concluding thoughts here to help us as we think about teaching this lesson this coming Sunday. Number one, believers can point to God as the source of wisdom when called on to address difficult situations. Number two, believers can recognize times when God places them in specific situations to represent Him. And number three, believers can be confident God will equip them to accomplish His purposes for their lives. As you create interest in this lesson at the very beginning, ask the group to discuss the most difficult life goal or accomplishment they've ever had to achieve, and then discuss how they were able to achieve it. The most important thing is sticking to it. And that's what Joseph did. If he had not stuck to what God had purposed in his life, he would have never reached it. And then teach the Bible study. And then the final challenge is this. What is it that God has asked you to do? Are you still waiting to do that? Well, don't wait. Stay faithful. Commit to remain faithful. Whatever it is, don't give up. Stay true to what God has called you to do. Well, I'll be praying for you. The title of this lesson is Opportunity Knocks. The point of the lesson is that God gives His followers opportunity to make a difference within His divine plan. I'll be praying for you. God bless.